My name is Valentina Cruz. I am 31 years old, and I used to believe that a man who loved you would stay. I was wrong. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I used to believe that, because this story is not about a sudden revelation. It is about a slow accumulation of evidence that I kept filing away in the wrong drawer. The one labeled his family is just like that, and he will be different when it matters. I kept that drawer very organized. I kept adding to it for 4 years. I did not open it until the night my contractions were 11 minutes apart and my husband, Marco, was loading a duffel bag into his father's SUV in our own driveway. There was one other thing in that driveway that night that mattered: my hospital bag already packed and standing by the bedroom door, with a manila envelope tucked into the outer pocket. I had put it there 3 weeks earlier. I had hoped I would not need it. I understood, watching the duffel go into the car, that I would. I am a registered nurse. I have been one since I was 24, which means I have spent 7 years watching people make decisions under pressure. I know what calm looks like when it is real and when it is performed. I know what fear looks like when someone is managing it and when someone has simply decided the fear is not theirs to carry. I work labor and delivery. I have held the hands of women whose partners did not make it to the hospital in time, women who came alone by choice. I have never once judged any of them. I mention my profession not because it makes what happened to me more dramatic, but because it is the reason I knew with clinical certainty what was happening to my own body at 6:42 on a Thursday evening in late October. My contractions had been irregular since that morning, long gaps, then clusters, the kind of pattern that could go either way. By 4 in the afternoon they were settling into something more purposeful. By 6 they were 11 minutes apart. I had my hospital bag packed. I had called my attending, Dr. Flores, who told me to monitor and come in when they reached 7 minutes or my water broke, whichever came first. If you have ever watched someone choose comfort over the person they promised to stay beside, you already know what I am about to describe. If you have not, if you are watching this right now and thinking that surely there is an explanation, that surely no one would do what I am going to tell you, I want you to sit with that thought for a moment. Hold it. Because I thought the same thing every step of the way, right up until he closed the car door and his father's taillights disappeared around the corner. The plan changed because of Rodrigo Navarro. That was my father-in-law's name. Rodrigo Navarro. He was 63 years old, retired from a construction supply business he had built in Phoenix over 30 years, and he was the kind of man who believed that his preferences were facts and that his schedule was weather, simply a condition everyone else adapted to. He had planned a 4-day trip to the Grand Canyon with Marco and his mother, Esperanza, a trip that had originally been scheduled for late September before a family conflict pushed it back. When I entered my 3rd trimester, the trip was still on the calendar. When my due date was confirmed as November 4th and the trip was October 24th through 27th, Rodrigo did not adjust the trip. He adjusted his assessment of the risk. "First babies are always late," he told Marco. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. My mother went 2 weeks past with me. Valentina has weeks left. I set the dish towel down on the counter. I walked to the sink and ran the water for a moment before turning it off. Then I went back to folding the dish towel. I said nothing. The trip had been a source of low-grade tension for 6 weeks, and the particular shape of that tension was something I had learned to recognize over 4 years of marriage into the Navarro family. It never came as a direct argument. Rodrigo did not raise his voice. He did not say, "I don't care about your pregnancy" or "the trip matters more than you." What he said instead was a sequence of reasonable-sounding sentences that arrived one at a time, each one small enough to step over, until you looked back and realized you were standing in a completely different place than where you had started. The first one had come 6 weeks earlier, at Sunday dinner at Rodrigo and Esperanza's house in the Foothills neighborhood. The 4 of us were at the table: Rodrigo, Esperanza, Marco, and me, 8 months pregnant and sitting slightly sideways in the chair because it was the only comfortable angle. The trip had come up because Marco mentioned I had an appointment that Monday and the doctor had confirmed everything was on track. "So November 4th is still the target," Marco said. He said it with a small kind of pride, the way people announce something good. Rodrigo nodded slowly. He had a way of nodding that was not agreement, it was processing, and it always preceded a reframe. "Target," he said. "Right. First babies rarely arrive on target." He looked at me with an expression I had seen many times. It was warm. It was patient. It was the expression of a man explaining a fact to someone who did not yet understand the world. When Marco was born, Esperanza was 4 days past her due date. His cousin Tomas was 12 days past. These things don't work like a calendar, Mija. He called me Mija when he was correcting me. It was a specific usage. I know, I said. I work labor and delivery. He smiled. Of course. But you know how it is, when it's your own, it's different. You'll be more anxious than your patients. That's natural. I looked at the tablecloth. It was white linen with a pale yellow embroidered border. Esperanza had made it herself. I traced the edge of the nearest flower with my thumb under the table where no one could see. The trip is 3 weeks before her due date, Marco said. He was not arguing. He was presenting information the way he always did, offering it to his father the way you offer something breakable, carefully, ready to take it back. Exactly, Rodrigo said. 3 weeks. Plenty of margin. And honestly, the drive to the South Rim is 4.5 hours. If anything were to start, you'd have time to turn around. He looked at Marco. You have your phone. Valentina is a medical professional. She knows what to watch for. That was the first time he said it. She knows what to watch for. As if my professional knowledge was a reason I needed less support, rather than a reason I was more acutely aware of every possible complication. I picked up my water glass and held it for a moment before I set it back down. I'd feel better if you stayed, I said to Marco. I said it directly to him, not to Rodrigo, because I understood even then that Rodrigo was the audience and Marco was the variable. Marco looked at his father. Then he looked at his plate. Then he looked at me. It's 3 weeks out, he said. Dad's right that first babies tend to run late. Rodrigo smiled at his son the way you smile at someone who has finally understood something. Then he refilled Marco's water glass and then mine and said, See? You'll be fine, Mija. We'll have our phones. It's 4 days. That was the template. That was how it always went. By the time Rodrigo was done, Marco had not been persuaded so much as reoriented, the way you slowly turn a compass by holding a magnet near it, so gradually that the needle appears to drift on its own. I drove home that night. Marco fell asleep in the passenger seat 20 minutes in. I kept my eyes on the highway and let him sleep. Over the following weeks, the same pattern repeated in smaller iterations. When I asked Marco to finalize the hospital bag checklist, he agreed and then mentioned his father thought it was still early. When I asked him to put the car seat base in before the trip, he did it, but told me his father had said it might make people nervous, like we were being superstitious. When I suggested we go over the emergency contact protocol one more time, Marco said, Val, my dad thinks you're making yourself more anxious by over-preparing. Maybe he has a point. Each sentence was a small adjustment. Each one alone was dismissible. Together they amounted to a full degree of rotation, every week for 6 weeks. By the time October 24th arrived, I had been repositioned so incrementally that even I had begun to doubt my own calibration. I was a labor and delivery nurse who had watched hundreds of deliveries. I knew that 37 weeks was full term. I knew that early labor in a first-time mother could progress slowly or quickly, and that 11 minutes apart could become 7 in an hour. I knew all of this with the same certainty I knew my own name. And I had still spent 6 weeks being told, in the warmest and most patient register possible, that I was being anxious. The Rodrigo Navarro I had met 4 years earlier at a barbecue in Marco's cousin's backyard was charming in a way that felt substantial. He was a self-made man who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered things. He was funny without needing everyone to know it. When I told him I was a nurse working labor and delivery, he had said, "That takes a kind of person. Not everyone can hold space for that much vulnerability." I had thought, this is a man who sees people. I was not wrong exactly. Rodrigo did see people. He was very good at it. What I had not yet understood was that he saw people the way a contractor reads a blueprint, efficiently for structural information, to know where the load-bearing walls were so he could work around them. He had started working around mine within the first year. Marco and I got engaged 14 months after that barbecue. Rodrigo had taken Marco to lunch the week before and told him what he thought about the timeline, that we were moving fast, that he wasn't sure I was settled yet, that a nurse's schedule was hard on a marriage. Marco told me this 3 months later during an unrelated argument as a piece of context he had apparently been carrying. When I asked why he hadn't mentioned it at the time, he said he hadn't wanted me to feel unwelcome. I was already unwelcome. He had just delayed my knowing it. At the engagement dinner Rodrigo threw for us, his idea, his house, his guest list, he gave a toast that was a masterpiece of its form. He talked about Marco's character. He talked about the family legacy. He said, near the end, "And Valentina, we hope you'll come to see this family as your home. That's what family is for." He looked at me when he said it. He was smiling. Everyone else was smiling. I smiled too. It was only later, washing my hands in the bathroom upstairs, that I understood the construction. "We hope you'll come to see," as if I had not yet arrived, as if belonging was something I would need to earn over an unspecified period of time, as if 4 years of knowing Marco and 14 months of loving him had still not brought me fully through the door. I had told my mother about that dinner. She had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Be careful with that one." I told her she was reading too much into a toast. By the 2nd year of marriage I had begun to catalogue, without intending to, the specific texture of the things Rodrigo said to me, and the things he said about me when he thought I was not listening. To Marco, "Valentina works so hard," said with a kind of weight, like work was a substitute for something I was missing. To his sister at Christmas, "She's very independent. Always has been." The word independent delivered with a slight tilt, so it landed somewhere between a compliment and a diagnosis. To me directly, when I disagreed with a family decision about where to spend Thanksgiving, "Of course you see it differently. You didn't grow up with our traditions." I grew the vegetable garden behind our house for 3 consecutive years, tomatoes, squash, peppers, herbs, and kept it producing through the Tucson summers when most people gave up on growing anything. I brought produce to every Sunday dinner for 2 years running and left whatever was left on Esperanza's kitchen counter without announcement. I learned Esperanza's tamale recipe and made it for Christmas 2 years in a row because she had mentioned once, in passing, that her hands tired faster than they used to. I drove Rodrigo to a cardiology follow-up appointment when Marco was stuck at a job site and Esperanza didn't drive on the freeway. 2 hours round trip, waiting room, pharmacy stop on the way home, and he thanked me by saying in the car, "You know, Marco worries you work too much to want a family." I told him I thought you'd come around. I gripped the steering wheel and watched the exit signs and said, "I'm glad you two talk." I managed Marco's family's holiday coordination for 3 years, RSVPs, dietary restrictions, venue logistics for the big extended family gatherings that Rodrigo expected to happen and expected to happen correctly. I did this without being asked and without being thanked because it was simply assumed to be the kind of thing I would handle. When I suggested in the 3rd year that we might rotate hosting responsibilities so the burden was shared, Rodrigo had looked at Marco and said, "She's right. Of course. Though I wonder if people would find a different venue strange after all this time." The gathering stayed at our house. The coordination stayed with me. During my pregnancy I had managed my own prenatal care schedule while working 3 12-hour shifts a week through my 2nd trimester and 2 shifts through my 3rd. I had built the nursery furniture over 2 weekends because Marco's back was bothering him. I had researched, selected, and installed the car seat myself after watching 4 instructional videos because the manual was ambiguous about one of the anchor points. I had written the birth plan, coordinated with Dr. Flores, updated the emergency contact sheet, and prepared a printed 1-page summary of my medical history for the hospital intake team because I knew from my own work how much faster things moved when the paperwork was done. I had done all of this while being told in the warmest possible register that I was probably overthinking it. By 6 in the evening on October 24th, 2 things were true simultaneously. My contractions were 11 minutes apart, purposeful and tightening in a way I recognized from the other side of the bed rail. And Rodrigo's SUV was idling in our driveway. I had told Marco at 4 o'clock, when the contractions began clustering. I had used clinical language because I knew he responded better to specificity than to urgency. "They're becoming regular," I said. 11 to 13 minutes. "You should know." Marco had gone very still in the way he always did when 2 competing obligations arrived at the same moment. Then he had taken out his phone and called his father. I did not hear Rodrigo's side of the conversation. I heard Marco's side, the long silences where he was listening, the 2 or 3 times he said right, the moment near the end when he said, "She says they're regular," and then, after another silence, "Okay." He came back into the bedroom where I was sitting on the edge of the bed with my hands flat on my thighs. "Dad says first labors average 18 to 20 hours, Marco said. He looked it up. I looked at him. He says if you're only at 11 minutes, you're hours away from needing to go in. He says the drive is 4.5 hours and they can turn around the minute anything changes. He paused. He already loaded the car. My throat tightened. I felt it close the way a fist closes, not fast but deliberate. Marco, I said. I work labor and delivery. I know what 11 minutes apart means. I know, he said. But you also know it could stall. You've said that yourself. First labors stall all the time. This was true. I had said that. I had said it in a different context, in a different conversation, as a piece of general information. Rodrigo had apparently stored it. I need you to stay, I said. He sat down on the bed next to me. He took my hand. He held it in both of his and looked at it the way people look at something they have already made a decision about. Val, he said. My dad planned this trip for 8 months. My mom's been talking about it since August. If something actually starts, I'm 4.5 hours away. That's nothing. You have your phone. Dr. Flores is on call. You know every person in that hospital. I squared my hands on my knees before I answered him. I am in labor, I said. Early labor. But labor. You might be, he said. Or it might stall by morning. He kissed my forehead. He told me he would have his phone on full volume all night. He told me to call the second anything changed. Then he picked up his duffel bag from the corner of the room and walked down the stairs. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sound of the front door, then the car door, then the SUV engine turning over. I heard Rodrigo say something and Marco laugh, a short, easy sound that traveled through the bedroom window the way ordinary sounds do when everything around them has become very strange. The taillights swept across the ceiling of the room as the car pulled out. I sat there for another full minute. Then I picked up my phone and opened my contraction timer app and pressed start. The contractions reached 7 minutes apart at 9:14 that night. I know the exact time because I was still watching the app, sitting in the same spot on the bed where Marco had left me, my hospital bag on the floor by the door, my phone face up on the nightstand. I had called Dr. Flores at 8:50 when they crossed 8 minutes. She told me to come in. I told her I would. I did not tell her I was alone. I drove myself to the hospital. I parked in the patient drop-off because I decided that was what I was, a patient, and I walked through the sliding doors with my bag over one shoulder and my phone in my hand, and I checked myself in at the desk where 2 of my colleagues were working the night shift. Renata, who had trained with me, looked up and said, "Val?" And I said, 7 minutes, and she came around the desk and walked me back herself. I texted Marco from triage, at the hospital. 7 minutes. Come back. He called immediately. I did not answer. I sent him the triage room number. He called again. I silenced it. At 9:47 he sent a text. Dad says if you're stable we should wait and see how things progress. He says you're in the best possible place. Call me when you can. I read it twice. Then I put the phone face down on the tray table next to me. Renata came in to check my monitor and saw my face. She did not ask. She pulled a chair up next to the bed and sat with me for 20 minutes until she had to go back to the floor, and that was more than my husband's father thought I was owed. My daughter was born at 6:18 the following morning. 11 hours and 4 minutes after I drove myself through those sliding doors. She was 6 pounds 14 ounces. She had a full head of dark hair and she cried immediately and strongly, which Dr. Flores said was a very good sign, and I held her against my chest and I felt something settle in me that had been loose and rattling for a long time. Marco arrived at 9:52 that morning. He had driven through the night once his father finally agreed the situation was real. He came into the room pale and hollow-eyed and he stopped in the doorway when he saw me holding our daughter, and his face did something complicated that I did not try to interpret. "Val," he said. "Her name is Sophia," I said. "I named her this morning." He crossed the room and looked at her. He touched her hand with one finger. He said, "I'm sorry," and I believed he meant it, and I also understood that it was not enough and that he knew it was not enough and that we were both, in that moment, aware of a distance between us that had been growing for 4 years and had finally become visible. Rodrigo arrived at 11:30. He came in behind Esperanza, who went immediately to the baby with tears already running down her face, and he stood near the door with his hands clasped in front of him and the expression he used when he was preparing to be reasonable. "Valentina," he said. "She's beautiful. You did beautifully." I looked at him. I let the silence sit for a full 3 seconds. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I need to speak with you." Can you stay after Esperanza goes to get lunch? I have something I want to show you. He nodded slowly. The nod that was not agreement. Esperanza left at 12:15, taking Marco with her to the cafeteria. I had asked Marco specifically to go. I had framed it as giving his mother time with him, which was true, and he had agreed without pressing me, which was also something I had understood about him for a long time. Rodrigo settled into the chair near the window. Sophia was in the bassinet between us. He looked at her with what I think was genuine warmth. That was always the most complicated thing about Rodrigo. The warmth was real. It simply did not extend far enough to inconvenience him. I'm glad you're both well, he said. I reached into the outer pocket of my hospital bag and removed the manila envelope. I set it on the tray table between us. I want to walk through something with you, I said. He looked at the envelope. What is this? Open it. He opened it. Inside were 4 documents. The first was a single printed page, a time-stamped record from my contraction timer app, showing the progression from 4:02 p.m. to 9:14 p.m. on October 24th. Irregular, clustering, then regular, then 7 minutes. Clean data. Irrefutable. He looked at it for a moment. Valentina. The second one, I said. The second document was a printed copy of the text thread between Marco and me from that evening. His texts. My texts. The one where he relayed his father's assessment that I was in the best possible place and that they should wait and see. Rodrigo's jaw tightened slightly. He turned the page. The third document was 2 pages, a printed summary which I had prepared myself, of the clinical literature on labor progression in first-time mothers, specifically the section on the range of progression rates and the risks associated with delayed hospital arrival. I had highlighted 2 passages. I had added a note in the margin in my own handwriting. I know this because I do this work. He set it down without speaking. The fourth document was a single page. It was the hospital intake record showing my arrival time, 9:31 p.m., with the field 4 accompanied by left blank and below it, in the notes section, Renata's intake notation, patient arrived unaccompanied, self-transported, contractions 7 minutes. I placed my hand flat on top of the 4 documents. I want you to understand what happened, I said. Not what you told Marco had probably happened. What actually happened. He looked at me. His expression had shifted into something I had not seen from him before. Not anger, not warmth, but a careful stillness, the kind that appears when someone realizes the conversation has a different shape than they expected. I understand you're upset, he said. I squared the papers in front of me before I answered him. I'm not upset, I said. I'm clear. He started to say something about intentions. He said the word reasonable twice. He said he had been working from the information available to him, and that first labors statistically, and I let him finish. I let him complete the full sentence, the one about statistics and averages, and how he had simply been trying to help Marco make a clear-headed decision. Then I looked at him and I said, You told me 6 weeks ago at your dinner table that first babies rarely arrive on target. You said that while I was sitting 8 months pregnant in a chair I had to angle sideways to sit in comfortably. What I was actually doing during those 6 weeks was monitoring my own body every single day, building a go bag, installing a car seat, and writing a birth plan alone, so that when something happened there would be a system. Because I knew you were going to say exactly what you said. He opened his mouth. You told Marco that I knew what to watch for, I said. You said it like my training was a reason he could leave. What I was actually doing, what that training meant, was that I knew at 6:42 p.m. that I was in early labor. Not maybe. Not possibly. I knew. And I drove myself to the hospital at 9 o'clock at night alone, and I checked in at the desk where my colleagues work, and I named our daughter by myself the next morning because you decided your timeline mattered more than mine. My voice did not rise. I had practiced this, not the words exactly, but the register, the flat, even informational register I used on the floor when something had gone wrong and I needed the room to understand it without panic. You told Marco in the car that evening that I was in the best possible place, I said. You were right about that. I was. Because I put myself there. Alone. At 9:30 at night. In labor. Rodrigo sat with his hands on his knees. His face had done several things in the last 2 minutes and had settled on something that was not quite remorse and not quite anger. It was the expression of a man who has been handed a mirror and is deciding whether to look at it. I think, he said slowly, that we all could have communicated better. I nodded once. That's one way to see it. I picked up the 4 documents and returned them to the manila envelope. I placed the envelope back in my hospital bag. Then I looked at Sophia in her bassinet, and I let the room be quiet for a moment. I'm going to ask you to go now, I said. I'd like some time with her before Esperanza comes back. He stood. He straightened his shirt. At the door he paused. For what it's worth, he said, she's beautiful. I know, I said. I was there. He left. Marco came back 20 minutes later without his mother, who had apparently decided to give us space. He came in and sat in the chair Rodrigo had been sitting in and looked at the floor between his feet for a long time. He told me, Marco said. What you showed him. Good, I said. Val. He looked up. I don't know what to say. I know, I said. That's been true for a while. We were quiet. Sophia made a small sound in the bassinet and we both looked at her, and for a moment the room held all 3 of us in a stillness that felt different from the distance, not resolved but real. Things have to change, I said. I need you to hear that clearly. I know, he said. Not from your father's summary of what I said. From me directly right now. Things have to change. He nodded. This time it was not his father's nod. It was slower and smaller and it cost him something. Okay, he said. I did not tell him it would be fine. I did not know if it would be fine. What I knew was that I had a daughter in a bassinet who had arrived on her own schedule and been caught by people who showed up, and that I intended to be one of those people for the rest of her life, and that I would be watching very carefully to see who else would be. Sophia is 7 months old now. She is loud and determined, and she has a look she gives you when she wants something, direct, patient, completely unmoved by your inconvenience, that I recognize from the mirror. Marco calls it her negotiating face. I call it knowing what you want. Marco and I are still together. It is not the same as before, which I think is the correct outcome. Before was built on a foundation that had a slow leak in it, and we have spent the last 7 months either fixing the leak or deciding together which parts of the structure are still worth keeping. It is not romantic. It is honest, which is harder and more useful. Rodrigo came to see Sophia twice in the first month and has been more careful since then, more careful with his sentences, with his timing, with the specific way he addresses me directly instead of through Marco. I do not know if this is change or adjustment. I am watching. What I have thought about in the 7 months since that hospital room is how long I spend interpreting the warmth as evidence against the pattern. How many times I filed something in the wrong drawer because the person delivering it seemed too reasonable, too calm, too clearly well-intentioned. Cruelty that arrives without heat is still cruelty. The temperature doesn't change the content. I have thought about the version of this story where I did not prepare that envelope. Where I absorbed what happened the way I had absorbed everything else, translated it into its most charitable form, stored it away, kept going. There were years of practice in that direction. It would have been easy. But I am a labor and delivery nurse. I know that the things you do not address do not resolve on their own. They progress. And at a certain point, the window for intervention closes. I chose to intervene while the window was still open. If there is something useful in this story, I think it is that the people who dismiss you most effectively are often the ones who do it with the most warmth. They are not easier to deal with. They are harder. Because you have to hold 2 true things at once, that the warmth is real and that it does not excuse the pattern, and that kind of double vision is exhausting. But it is the only accurate way to see. If this story made you think of someone in your own life, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes it helps to know you are not the only one who has been very carefully, very kindly, left out of the picture. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. All names, characters, and events are products of the imagination and do not represent any real persons or situations.